Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian STEP program webinar. We're excited to have you here with us today. Perhaps you've attended some of our recent sessions. Maybe you have, this is the first one and you want to look back at some of the other resources we have. So we're going to be able to share a lot of information with you today about STEP and all the other resources that are available through. But we're really going to be talking about road diets. You might know that road diets are among the STEP Spectacular 7 countermeasures that can improve pedestrian crossings and safety. We're going to go into some detail today about road diets and specifically shed some light and showcase some of the work being done in Virginia, both by Virginia DOT, Fairfax County DOT, and City of Alexandria, and really talking about coordination and collaboration between agencies to get these types of projects on the ground. So we're glad that you all could join us today for this webinar. I wanted to, right off the bat, introduce you to the panelists who are going to be joining us today. So first up, we're going to have Peter Olms, who researches bicycle and pedestrian and transit and planning topics for the Virginia DOT's research division, the Virginia Transportation Research Council. His current and recent research includes road diets, prioritization practices for curb ramp improvements, bike box or turn box evaluation, statewide non-motorized travel monitoring programs, and low-speed pedestrian and bicycle alert systems for transit buses. So we're excited to have Peter here to share some of the work they're doing. Lance Duggold is also here with us. He's a senior research scientist at the Virginia Transportation Research Council, which is the research division of Virginia DOT. His primary research interests involve traffic incident management, system operations, safety, and planning. We're also joined by John Belechek, who serves as the statewide bicycle and pedestrian planner at the Virginia DOT, where he's the lead subject matter expert on bicycle and pedestrian transportation. John previously worked in the office of the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he focused on safety, pedestrian, and bicycle issues. Nicole Winans is also joining us. She is an active transportation planner with the Fairfax County Department of Transportation. Nicole has over 10 years of experience in bicycle and pedestrian planning and policy, including 5 years with the League of American Bicyclists Bicycle Friendly America program. So we're glad to have Nicole with us. And we're also joined by Christine Mayer, who is a principal planner and Complete Streets program manager with the City of Alexandria. In her role, she manages and coordinates efforts to improve traffic safety, as well as multimodal accessibility and mobility through the Complete Streets program, which includes the Vision Zero initiative, implementation of the pedestrian and bicycle master plan, capital projects, as well as infrastructure planning for the city's Safe Routes to School program. So we've got a great group here to share their perspectives with us. I don't want to delay their presentations too long at all, but I do want to share just a few brief notes on housekeeping items that'll be helpful to you. As attendees, you won't be able to speak up during the webinar, but you will be able to submit questions and comments to us. So please do that anytime using the questions pod. I'm going to respond to those, and we've got folks to respond to those questions as we can. And we're going to be using your questions to frame out our discussion period. We've got about 20 to 25 minutes scheduled at the end of the webinar, just specifically to answer those questions. You can find an archive of this webinar at www.pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. We've already posted a PDF copy of the slide presentation we'll be using today. It's also available to you as a handout in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you navigate there, you can download that. We're going to be recording the webinar and adding the recording to that page as soon as we have it ready, maybe a couple of hours after the webinar is completed today. So you'll be able to come back and look at all this information if you'd like to, or share it with colleagues who weren't able to attend. Later today, I'm going to send up a follow-up email to you, and it'll have information about how you can access the archive page, as well as claim professional development credit for the webinar. If you are a planner and you're used to claiming AICP credits, there are 1.5 CMs approved for today's webinar. Just navigate to their page and claim those as you usually would. Every attendee is going to receive a certificate of attendance showing they've completed 1.5 hours of instruction. So that should help you self-report those PDHs and other professional development hours that you need to log. So again, that information is coming to you later today. There is an upcoming webinar from the STEP program that you might want to check out. It's also available at that page that you'll see linked above. It's MPO and DOT partnerships on Complete Streets projects, and we're going to be profiling some work happening in Florida, specifically collaboration between Florida DOT and Broward MPO to look at how regional agencies can really help support and partner with states to deliver these projects. So we encourage you to check that out. It's going to be coming up on July 29th. I'll share some information shortly with you via the chat pod about how you can register for that session and access some of this other information. I encourage everyone to, if you haven't done so already, to check out the STEP program website, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian. We'll push out a link to that soon. Even if you're familiar with it, you want to check it out again, because there are going to be, over the next few days, some new STEP resources coming out, some new information, some new case studies that you might be interested in. So be on the lookout for that. We'll probably provide more detail about those maybe later this month in our next webinar, but you can find them there. STEP is really all centered around how we can improve pedestrian crossings, specifically uncontrolled crossings, and these spectacular 7 countermeasures that are laid out in STEP. We will find out today a little bit more about road diets, which are one of them, but they're each worth a close look and consideration about how your agency might be able to use these to improve pedestrian crossings, a lot of times in combination with one another. And there's some really useful guidance on the STEP website, a guide for improving safety at uncontrolled crossings that allows you to use a table, a matrix of different types of information about your site to really determine which of these countermeasures really need to be used at that location. I want to kind of center the discussion or kick it off by saying one of the elements of STEP is really to look at a variety of factors about the location, including the cross section, the number of lanes. And I think looking at road diet specifically, which can alter the configuration of the roadway and change it, might be a good first step to consider when thinking about crossings. By doing a road diet, you might be able to utilize other countermeasures after that road diet is done to improve those crossings. So really ties a lot of these countermeasures together within the STEP program. So I hope you'll check out that information. I'm leaving some information here on the screen, some contacts at FHWA, Becky Crow, who's with us today, and Peter Unn, both at FHWA, some examples of these resources here on the left, and a website where you can find more, which we'll definitely share with you soon. So check that out and let us know what questions you have about STEP. But what I'm going to do now is turn the screen over, turn the presentation over to Peter Olms for our first presentation. So Peter, I've got the screen coming to you, and I'll let you know when we've got your presentation up.
All right.
Perfect. You're all set, Peter.
Thanks, Dan. This is a study that Lance Dougal worked on with me. He's on the call today, and Hannah McKnight also joined us on this. We have a report available already at vtrc.virginiadot.org, so you can go there and get all the details you want. This was work that we did pre-COVID, so we're not talking about pandemic-related roadway reallocations. But let me start by sort of setting the stage for where I'm planning to go, and hopefully the other panelists will add to this after I kind of give an overview, give some definitions of road diets, and then I'll talk about what the research says, what have other people found in terms of the effects of road diets, and I'll talk about what we did in terms of finding out where road diets were in Virginia and how we analyzed a couple of examples. So how did we get here? Several decades ago, widening a road to 4 lanes was a quick way to add some capacity in response to widespread automobility. So you might end up with a 4-lane undivided roadway when you perform a widening, or maybe you build it that way when you have a new roadway through a subdivision. And that's kind of where we start. And then the road diet becomes when you change at least one general purpose lane of a road like that, or maybe like something else, into another type of facility. So this image shows the most typical reconfiguration, which is converting a 4-lane road into a 3-lane road that has bicycle lanes. But there are lots of variations, and Virginia has many different kinds of those. Some don't have bike lanes, some maybe have a median, some are one-way instead of 2-way streets. So lots of different options, but the main thing is you're removing at least one lane. And by doing that during a planned resurfacing project, you can deliver safety and multimodal improvements for only the incremental cost of additional signs and pavement markings. You can also do a road diet outside the repaving process, but you would need to eradicate your lines and restripe. There's a related term if we get super specific, and I use the term lane diets for that, which is where you are not changing the number of lanes, you're just narrowing their width. And our research effort focused on road diets, where you're removing at least one lane, and not the lane diets, but both are types of roadway reconfigurations. So a little background about VDOT. The agency handles public roads all across Virginia, so we have a large state-run, state-maintained roadway network. Only independent cities, some of our towns, and 2 of our counties maintain their own roads. So Fairfax County is a large county just outside the Washington, D.C., or in the Washington, D.C. area, and its roadways are all VDOT roads. And it has been adding dozens of miles of bike lanes, often through road diets, in collaboration with VDOT. VDOT has also seen some small towns work with the state DOT to get some road diets completed. And we knew that localities that maintain their own roads, cities like Alexandria, had conducted road diets, but we really didn't know a couple years ago how many or where. And so that led into this research study. And so the goals of that were to find out how are road diets working, to improve our understanding of past road diets in the state, and to find out how we might want to develop guidance for road diets in Virginia. And you'll hear about that later from John. So getting there meant reviewing the literature to determine how other road diets had been analyzed and how performance had been quantified. And to get that statewide picture, we sent out a survey to localities. We also looked at the data from a couple road diets on VDOT roads in Fairfax County, just as some examples to see what kinds of issues might be encountered. So I'll start with reviewing what the research says. In the simplest terms, the 4-lane roads are not so safe and the 3 lanes are safer. What that means is those 4-lane undivided roads have several issues. One is that left lane through traffic is in conflict with left turning vehicles. The first one wants to go straight ahead. The second one wants to stop there and turn. So there's a higher rate of some crash types compared to other roadway layouts. These 4-lane roads also tend to lack bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, although the one in my picture here has sidewalks. And the 3-lane configuration provides turning traffic somewhere to wait. In this case, it's left turn pockets. And bicyclists have their own space. In this case, it's buffered bike lanes. And pedestrians who are crossing the street may have an easier time with those traffic flows better organized. Digging a little more into what the research says, the most comprehensive resource on road diets is this FHWA Road Diet Informational Guide. It summarizes studies conducted prior to its publication in 2014. And those studies looked at cases that had varying traffic volumes from fairly low to sort of on the upper end of what you might do a road diet on this 26,000 vehicles per day. And they also had varying crash reduction outcomes. They saw some speed reductions in terms of average speed before and after the road diet, and improved speed harmony, which simply means the cars are traveling similar speeds instead of some of them zooming past and some of them poking along. The guide also pointed out that traffic volume does matter as automobile level of service decline. As automobile volumes go up, automobile level of service is likely to decline. You can mitigate that somewhat with signal timing optimization. Your safety benefits may also start to diminish as you get those higher traffic volumes. And it pointed out that streets with transit routes may need to have some operational analysis just to think about how the transit buses stopping in the road might affect things. So given the baseline provided by this guide, our search focused on literature and publications after 2014 to get a snapshot of work about road diets approximately 5 years after this effort that was out there. So digging into that a little more, there were several categories of findings from the literature. One was looking at public opinion. People often get pretty upset when you change their roads. And one finding was that jurisdictions can address residents' concerns by giving them the types of information they value. Another thing we saw was that there were lots of different ways to quantify the success of a road diet, and it really depended on the focus. So if motorized traffic was what you were mostly concerned about, you'd look at traffic volumes, travel times, speeds, crashes, maybe cut through traffic as a result from traffic diverting away from the road that was dieted. If bicycle and pedestrian comfort or volumes are your main concern, you look at those volumes, maybe crashes and injuries involving bicyclists and pedestrians. If economic measures are a main concern, studies have looked at retail sales, employment numbers, the quantity of businesses along a corridor, or other ways to measure private investment. And outcomes from research studies on road diets were generally positive. For example, there was another FHWA publication that had 24 case studies, and they used various measures, but they all had generally positive outcomes for road diet projects. So what we did with the literature to get a little more detail was to divide the studies into several categories, and our report has detailed findings in the form of these comparative tables for each of these categories. It's essentially studies that are directly looking at a road diet, and then some other types of studies that also included elements of road diet projects. So one example of these comparative tables of the literature, which don't translate well to a PowerPoint format, is shown here. This is actually only the first half of the table. It points out there are these two studies from 2015. They were not focused on road diets, but they did have at least one case study of a road diet in them. And the table simply summarizes each study's data, findings, limitations, and recommendations. So this first one, you can see there are a few different road diets that are contained in that study: New Orleans, Chicago, Urbana, Illinois. It points out that this Chicago example had an arterial resurfacing program that chose its corridors based on bicycle and pedestrian crashes and bicycle and pedestrian plans. And one sort of limitation or recommendation was that shifting an agency's focus to a system-wide perspective could be challenging. It could be difficult to look at a system level rather than just at a project level. The remainder of this table looks like that. I'm not going to talk about it, but you can access our report if you need to dig into some details of the literature. So turning to the question of what Virginia localities had done, we tried to ask them. We said, what road diets have you constructed since 2010? And give us some information about them. What did they look like before, after? Did they generally meet your expectations? And what we identified was over 60 projects across Virginia through this survey and some follow-up efforts. And we saw places across the state, clustered in Northern Virginia, of course, where we've talked about Fairfax County having dozens of these projects, but also in suburban and small town rural areas. Almost half of the reported road diets were that typical 4-lane to 3-lane conversion, but there were several other types, and we saw them in several different years, more recent being fresher in people's minds, of course. And we asked folks, why did you do a road diet? There could be multiple reasons, so there could be multiple answer choices, but improving safety and accommodating bike travel were the top 2 choices, followed by accommodating pedestrians. And in general, we just asked, did the projects meet your goals for them? And 80% were considered to have met their goals. There were some that had mixed results, and some folks said we did studies to find out if they met their goals, and we asked if we could obtain those studies. So finally, turning to our Fairfax examples, we needed to decide how to evaluate those road diets. What is the equivalent of a scale for road diets? And I've talked about that before, that it really depends on the goal. Because we were mostly concerned with whether road diets were causing major traffic hiccups, because that was a big concern of some of the public opposition to road diets. We looked at volumes and speeds for traffic before and after 4 road diets in Fairfax County. These were all relatively modest traffic volume roadways. The AADTs, the average daily traffic, were between 4,500 on the low end and 10,000 on the high end, which makes them pretty clear candidates for road diets. You'll hear later about some diets in other places, or in Virginia, but not these that are on the higher end of that volume spectrum. For one of these streets, we also obtained video to count people walking and biking. That was this street, Colts Neck. And we didn't see major changes in bike volumes, but we did see some apparent changes in where people were walking and riding. We like to see people who are walking doing that on the sidewalk, and people who are biking doing that in the street, especially in bike lanes going in the direction of traffic. And those correspond to the red and light blue chunks of the larger pies, which got bigger in the after case at one of these sites. So that was an encouraging finding. And this Colts Neck Road site performed sort of like we expected in terms of vehicular changes as well. Hourly volumes, which are the bars on the chart on the left, didn't really change. Average speeds, which are the lines in the chart on the left, were a bit lower after the road diet, and there was less high-end speeding, which is in the chart on the right. The bar categories above 35 miles per hour are speeders, and those categories went down in the after condition. So for this site, on weekdays, these results were statistically significant. So this is kind of what we expected to see elsewhere. We had additional sites that were road dieted in 2018, these two streets and the one on the next slide. But their after speeds were sometimes higher than the before speeds, which was kind of unexpected. And that wasn't always statistically significant. By and large, the traffic volumes still did not change. So that gives us some conclusions. One is road diets have lots of different forms besides the 4 to 3 lane conversion. There are even some road diets that have been road dieted, configured once and then reconfigured again. There are lots of different methods and performance measures that studies have used to evaluate road diets. Road diets have been incorporated into broader concepts and initiatives. Complete Streets was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar as the subject of another webinar. Complete Streets includes road diets. Context-sensitive design could also include road diets. And some projects that have road diet elements don't use that term. They stay away from it. But road diets overall do still work, whatever you call them. The literature has continued documenting their effectiveness in terms of various performance measures. And the localities in Virginia that we heard from said that they did not generally see traffic congestion problems from these projects, and that in their opinions, they'd met the primary goals. Most of the folks who had received public feedback had gotten mostly positive or mixed feedback about the project. Additionally, for our Fairfax County cases, we didn't see any practically significant speed changes. There were some changes in some time periods in some directions at some sites, but for those lower volume diets, we're not necessarily seeing a consistent trend in changes of speed. The volume changes for pedestrians and bicyclists were similarly not consistent, but we did have larger proportions of bicyclists and pedestrians using facilities as intended at one site after the road diet than before. The inventory we developed of almost 40 miles of road diets across over 60 projects is something that could be used for future planning and research studies in Virginia. And we identified additional research as possibly being useful, including developing crash modification factors, maybe for a specific configuration of road diets or Virginia-specific crash modification factors. And we tried to point out that routinely performing road diets on VDOT roadways where the conditions allow for it might have some safety and multimodal connectivity benefits. So with that, I will turn things back to Dan, and we'll hear from the next person.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Lance, for your work on this project, on this research. It's really valuable to kind of see some of the outcomes around the state. I'm going to move now over to John Polechek from Virginia DOT as well to share some more perspective on road diet work in the state. Okay, John, you're all set. John, you may be on mute.
Thank you. So
there you are.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Peter. That was a great introduction to what I'm going to talk about. Today, I'm going to talk about our what we started as a recommendation to develop some road diet guidelines. The reason we created these, or we started on this project of the road diet guidelines, is we had there were a recommendation in our pedestrian safety action plan. This is a plan that was created in 2018 after we saw a big jump in pedestrian fatalities in Virginia in 2016, and it had a number of recommendations, but this is one of them, and it was assigned to our division, and I was told to go forth with it. There are a couple other great reasons to do this as well. As Peter mentioned, we had a lot of examples of road diets already constructed in Virginia, so we had a lot of good lessons to learn. We also have great examples of processes of where these are happening annually, being a resurfacing program. You'll hear more from that from Nicole later today. And we really didn't have any place where we talked about how you could do one of these, where they had happened, lessons learned or tips and tricks, anything like that. So this was low-hanging fruit. Another reason was the wonderful success we had with the Lawyers Road Diet in Fairfax in 2009. This received national attention. It made the cover of the Federal Highway Road Diet Informational Guide. And as you can see on the right, it just had a really, really good reduction in crashes, 67% over 5 years. And so the only place that graphic lived was on the PowerPoint presentation of our former NOVA district traffic engineer, and we had a great story to tell. So we really needed to put it on some type of statewide guidance. So as I mentioned before, we started out with the scope to develop road diet guidelines, which was intended to be a document, and also perform 2 example studies and corridors where road diets could occur, and produce concept striping plans in addition to operational analysis to see if road diets would work on these 2 stretches, and kind of use those as examples that would be available on our website, which they are. That anybody could peruse, and if they're thinking about doing a project, could use those as a roadmap. So we had a stakeholder group meet for about a year, and going in, I thought, the traffic volume is going to be the biggest thing. People are going to know how high will we go, and it was absolutely not a priority for our stakeholder group. The district traffic engineers we have at VDOT are very capable. They felt like there was enough tools already available, such as the Seattle flow chart and the FHWA guide, to where, deciding on whether it was going to work was not a barrier. Instead, we identified 3 areas where there were barriers. The first was difficulty in coordinating with our resurfacing program. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. 2 was kind of how you go about doing this, what's required, how and what level of public involvement is needed. Is the email from the city manager enough, or the county manager, or do you actually need a resolution of support from the Board of Supervisors? And then 3rd was kind of this comfort level. If a locality was doing this for the first time, or there was a lot of reluctance to be the first one to do this. And, everybody's very worried if you're going to do this and then you receive pushback or you have to rip it up. That's the last thing they want. So what we actually decided to do was make this more of a brochure. So what you see in front of you is the first page of a 4-page brochure we created. It became less of a technical manual and more of a kind of informational guide that could be shared with county managers, elected officials. You could sit down and brief somebody, show them before and after examples, show them this map of Virginia that has happened in so many other places, and kind of really, this was viewed as the product that would add value that was kind of missing, where the technical analysis was already there. And kind of building on that theme, this is our website. So everything we created in our document and is on this website. We didn't want this to just be buried in a design manual or something with numbers. We kind of wanted transportation planners to elected officials to everybody to have access to this information so they could make good decisions moving forward. And here I'll just go over some of the examples we have. This is the first example we did. It's on the eastern shore of Virginia in a small town called Anancock. One thing I'll mention that we tried to do is we made all VDOT plans have to be signed and sealed, and this document is obviously not, but what it is, it's a concept plan that would be at the level that you could include in a resurfacing contract if you needed to, so that when whoever was bidding on the project, they'd know that they have extra pavement markings and things like that they'd have to do. And this example rose up because the town sent a letter to VDOT several years before saying we'd love to see this pursued as a road diet, but the road had actually just recently been resurfaced, so the pavement quality is quite good. And our second example is a more suburban location in Henrico County. This is the suburbs of Richmond, and both of these were typical 4-3 road diets. And I'll also note something interesting, which is that neither of them are going to pursue the resurfacing program to be implemented. At the conclusion of both these projects, the people wanted to move forward, and they're both being submitted to our Smart Scale program, which is a capital program because this has some extra elements, like you can see the pedestrian refuge, and there's also going to be a shared use path on the north side. And attached is also the operational analysis we did for the Hilliard Road project, just outlining if someone was interested in a road diet, here's how you could do it, getting traffic counts, determining the peak hour based on those counts, and then using HCM to do that analysis. As I mentioned, one of the biggest discussions we had as part of this was whether to use the resurfacing program to pursue your road diets. And the answer is, if you can do it, you should do it. The pros of doing the resurfacing program is that it's much cheaper than doing it otherwise. We also have a lot of data available. You can see this map, this ArcGIS Online map VDOT maintains and publishes every year with our pavement quality. So if you are doing a planning process, you can use that to anticipate what might be on the resurfacing program and then have striping plans and public involvement done ahead of time if you're proactive. The negatives of trying to only use the resurfacing program is that you don't know if your entire corridor you want to do your road diet on is on our resurfacing program. VDOT has to drive our resurfacing by pavement quality. So if only half of your corridor is on the resurfacing program and it doesn't end in a logical place, you're not going to be able to accomplish that project unless you bring local money to it. So that's one of the negatives. Additionally, if your road has just gotten resurfaced or if the pavement quality just remains good for whatever reason, and you have a major safety issue that a road diet could help with, you're going to be waiting maybe 10 years until that could be implemented. So there's pros and cons to each. And what we've kind of recommended in the guide is that if you're a locality pursuing these and you have maybe 15 candidates, what you should do is rank them by their pavement quality, and then work with VDOT and decide how to study it. But prioritize the ones with the lowest pavement quality that you're sure can be accomplished all in one swoop with the resurfacing program. And that way, if you do a couple each year, as the pavement quality gets worse and worse, generally the timing of your study is no more than a couple years behind that. That's another challenge is if you have a changing area and traffic volumes are increasing and you've done your study ahead of time. So it's kind of a balance on doing it right away versus planning it out ahead of time. And then, as I mentioned, the comfort level, we also created this ArcGIS Online map with 24 examples of both road diets and roadway reconfigurations, like lane diets, as Peter mentioned earlier. I'll note that our initial task was road diet guidelines, but we changed the name to roadway reconfiguration because nobody liked the word diet, and we also wanted to encompass lane diets and other types of cross-sectional allocation. So these 24 examples, this is a before example of a project just implemented this year, and here's the after example. We just wanted people to be able to pull up this map, and say you're the town or the county just over, you could say, okay, this is a roadway very similar to something I'm considering. Here's the traffic volume. Maybe I'll give this person a call. And a lot of times people just needed evidence that something similar had happened to be comfortable moving forward. I'll also note on here we have a example in Norfolk where the ADT was 20,000. So, you know, that's one of the higher end examples where no one can kind of say, okay, this hasn't been done before in Virginia. And then another GIS tool we created were these cut sheets where we just combined at least 6 or 7 data sets to have all the information you might need if you're in a meeting with somebody or you wanted to discuss, is this a good project? You could quickly look through these numbers and say, okay, this has adequate B over C ratio, and you're connecting 2 bike lanes and our volume looks good. This is a slam dunk, or something like this may be able to help you kind of scroll through your candidates quickly and decide which ones you want to pursue. And finally, just talking about next steps. As going through this, we realized that, you know, the main value we could serve is awareness, and the other value we could serve is funding. So we do have a pot of money set aside, planning funds, where we can assist districts if they have requests from localities for road diets. We can perform the studies, we can do the striping plans, and have everything ready, either for a grant application or the resurfacing program. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to you, Dan.
Great. Thank you so much. That's some great information there, and I like the kind of running through some of the lessons for other agencies considering these. So I appreciate that. I'm sure everybody else does as well. We're going to move right along and go from the state level to the county level and hear from Nicole Winans in Fairfax County. So Nicole, let me send the screen your way, and I'll let you know when you're all set up and ready to go. Great. I see your screen. You're all set.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Peter and John, for touching on some of the projects that Fairfax County and VDOT have done in collaboration over the past years in terms of road diets. So in my presentation, I want to focus a little bit on the process we are using to implement that large amount of restriping and road diets in our county. There you go. So as was mentioned before, we have about 20 road diets under our belt since about 2009. I believe Lawyers Roads that Peter and John mentioned was the first. And we have implemented road diets at a pace of about between 1 and 4 per year in a really programmatic approach that we're refining every year. And through this process, we have also added over 100 miles of on-street bike lanes in a total, combining road diets and lane diets. I think it's also important to know that if we have done this many road diets, that none of them were actually removed or considered as a failed road diet. But there are some that we know are only a temporary improvement, particularly in our rapidly growing urban areas in Reston and Tysons, where the current land use is still very suburban, so they can support a road diet. But once a much higher density is implemented along the same road, and the road will likely be completely reconstructed and widened with bike lanes, we will maintain the bike infrastructure, but the road diet will likely go away. But that has not stopped us from implementing it as an intermediate safety improvement and to providing bicycle and improved pedestrian facilities. And it would not be possible to do this many road diets without without public support, which has really been growing across the years and the many projects we have done. We still to this day have some controversial road diets, but overall we have implemented road diets without with a lot of public support and even no negative feedback from beginning to end. So that's really has made it a lot easier in recent years to get these implemented. We've also institutionalized this process in our comprehensive plan. I believe in 2014, this note was added to our policy text in our transportation policy plan that we as staff are directed or mandated to evaluate roads for road diets and lane diets to improve the bicycle infrastructure where appropriate. So here's an overview over the very, very rapid process of the implementation from beginning to end. And it's really sometimes as just a few months to up to about a year. So VDOT puts together their paving list or preliminary paving list in the early summer. I believe they actually started in March to determine road repaving candidates, and they kind of wiggle down until the summer when they share a first list that we review but not do too much with because we know it's very preliminary. And then we receive 2 or 3 more versions that become more and more final until we get a pre-final list in usually October or early November that we use to pre-scope really all roads that are on the paving list using GIS. So in previous years, VDOT shared these paving plans on paper maps. We have now migrated to GIS data, which is a lot easier to process because we can just overlay it with satellite imagery and traffic data that VDOT provides, as well as our bicycle master plan recommendations, where we can easily identify potential candidates for road and lane diets. At the same time, we also, around that time, start to consider pedestrian improvements. So we're not just looking at where bike lanes make sense or road diets, but also where are crosswalks missing, where are crosswalks that may need upgrading or moving. So that's something we added in the past 2 years to our process. And we still have to meet VDOT warrants for crosswalks. So we also have to do studies that have to be planned and implemented before the weather gets colder. So we have the pedestrian volumes that are more typical during peak times. So once we have a list of potential candidates that we would like to speak to VDOT about in regards to changing striping, we meet with VDOT usually 2 or 3 times, several hours to go over each project. We usually work with the local VDOT engineers in traffic engineering and signal specialists particularly on road diets to see how they work with volumes and signals along those corridors. And once we receive comments and approval from VDOT, we start to have that conversation with the local political stakeholders as well. They have often a very important local knowledge of traffic issues or safety issues that we may not know about, and they are able to provide a pre-approval of some of these projects in the districts, at least, so we can take it to the public for a public discourse about the ideas. So starting January, February, we provide information about these proposed projects online. We create a website for each district, so we list pictures before and afters of these projects that we're proposing, and host a public meeting in each district with a 2-week-long public comment period. So if somebody can't attend that meeting, they can still provide feedback. It's very helpful to receive some of these really detailed feedback in regards to what neighbors experience on these roads, because they often can tell, there are maybe unexpected traffic backups that we don't see in the data when we review the roads. And after the public outreach period is ending usually in early April, VDOT starts to work with their striping consultant on, getting the measurements of the roads that were approved and developing the striping plans that are then reviewed by the county and the political stakeholders for approval. And then really it goes straight into implementation as soon as the weather warms up in May up to December. The county, so VDOT implements the striping and the paving part, obviously as part of their paving program, but the county is supporting this process by implementing the signage. We can do it much faster through our own contracts. So VDOT provides the signage plans that we just pass on to our consultant, and we do the field work of marking where the signs would go. So all of this is a really rapid process that takes a lot of staff time and dedication, but it's very successful, and we're hoping to continue to refine this process and continue this process for the years to come. But we do have a couple lessons learned that we wanted to share with all of you. So one thing we learned is, the low-hanging fruit and the opportunities in the paving process are really great to take advantage of, to show off the positive effects without starting necessarily with Main Street or high volume street, to get the population and political stakeholders used to what does a road look like, how does it function. So that's a great way to start. And one thing we also learned was that land use is very important, not just the traffic data, but is there a fatal flaw? For example, is there a stadium arrival scenario? We had one case on South Lakes Drive in Reston where we were proposing a road diet on a 4-lane divided, which is a little bit more challenging because of the stacking of left turn movements. And in front of a high school, we found out during the public outreach process that there were so many cars arriving at the same time that they were blocking one of the lanes. So we were not able to take one of the lanes away, even though the average ADT was around 12,000, so well within the road diet range. So we had to find a solution of rerouting that bike route and leaving the full capacity just in front of the high school. So other land uses like that could be a mega church, for example, or a football stadium, just to keep something like that in mind. We also coordinate with our schools in general. If we change the striping or do a road diet in front of one of our public or private schools, we usually reach out to ensure that we don't impact their traffic too much. We've also used this entire process to work with our transit agency to make sure that the bus stops are where they're supposed to be. Often our bus stops are just what we call a stick in the mud, and they can easily be moved to a safer location, to the other side of the intersection or near a crosswalk, or the crosswalk can be moved to support the bus stop better. And it has structured our approach to fixing these transit corridor stops as part of this process as well. And then again, don't forget pedestrians. Road diets are very linear, and we often look at presentations that are very linear, but they're really an opportunity to enhance the pedestrian safety, add crosswalks, create space for pedestrian refuges, and increase, improve the signage if needed along the corridor. This is very time consuming if you have a lot of roads to look at, but it's worth it. We have done probably, I would say, 20 to 30 crosswalk improvements just in the past 2 years through this process. And the more recent lesson learned was that during implementation, after implementation, it is helpful to alert your drivers that the traffic pattern is changing, particularly if it's a complex intersection or an unexpected road diet that is not as visible from far away, that there's signage or alerts that alert drivers that something is different. And it does take 2 to 3 months for drivers to adjust to this new travel pattern, particularly if it's a 4-lane divided to 2-lane divided road conversion, or more complex road diet in general. But after 2 or 3 months, usually we see traffic to behave as expected, and communication about the road diet to become less and less. When they're originally concerns, once it's implemented, don't revert it back right away. Wait for a couple months to see what happens. And we usually see problems in the beginning and confusion in the beginning to go away. So here's my contact information if you would like more information about our process, or if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Nicole. I really appreciate all of that information and that insight, and really focusing on collaboration there. We have one more presentation. We're gonna continue our trip from the state to the county and now to the local level. Hear a different perspective from the city of Alexandria. Christine Mayer will be sharing with us some of their perspective and their projects. So Christine, keep an eye out, and I'll let you know when I've got your screen up. Wonderful. All right, you're all set.
Great, thank you. So in Alexandria, we have done a couple of different road diet or lane diet projects throughout the city. I'll talk about a couple more recent examples of projects. So Alexandria, if you don't know us, we are right near Arlington County on the south end, or we are south of Arlington County and along the Potomac, kind of bordered the rest of the way by Fairfax County. We own and maintain our streets, and that's everything except the interstate highways that kind of run through our community there. Our street types are mostly residential, kind of 2-lane roads. You're not going to see, there aren't a whole lot of 4-lane or more roads in the city, except for those that you see kind of on this Google map highlighted in yellow. So that kind of limits the opportunities that we have for projects like these, for road diets and for roads that may be eligible. We do follow MUTCD and FHWA standards, as well as VDOT when it's appropriate, and we have state and local funding that pays for the maintenance of our roads. So another thing that we work on through implementing road diets is implementing all of our plans that provide guidance for how our streets should look, what the goals should be of the design of our streets, and things like that. We've got environmental action plan, our city strategic plan. We are a Vision Zero city that is working to eliminate serious injuries and fatalities across the board. And we have a complete streets policy and design guidance that guides how we design our streets and what design is appropriate where. So our process for considering where to implement road reconfigurations, we do follow the resurfacing schedule, and we have tried now more in recent years to kind of back up our process to look a couple of years out from the paving schedule so that we can do our analysis and study and public outreach ahead of time before the paving trucks need to come in. We have kind of overlaid with that our planned multimodal facilities from our transportation master plan, VDOT data to determine where road diets may even be feasible from a cursory level, as well as FHWA guidance, crash data and crash risk, again, getting to kind of the safety factors, and other capital projects that may be in planning. So this is kind of the general guidance from FHWA about when you should consider a road diet for a specific roadway or candidate. Generally, our road diets tend to fall at this 4 to 3 level between the 10,000 to 15,000 and 15,000 to 20,000 ADT guidance. So we've done a couple of recent ones. North Van Dorn was a lower volume road that was done in 2015. I'll talk about, though, and focus most of my time on King Street and Seminary Road, which is the more recent project. So for King Street, we did a lot of outreach and had a community process through 2015 and 2016. We got approval from our local traffic and parking board in 2016 during the summer, implemented throughout the summer and into the fall, and then were requested to perform an evaluation after we completed that project. So this was the study area that we had, generally from Quaker to about Janney's Lane. We backed it up a little bit because of the volumes there at the intersection of King Street, Quaker Lane, and Braddock Road, down to Janney's Lane. The goals, like we've heard from the other presenters, improving safety, providing facilities for people to walk and bike and take transit and drive, and then implementing our plans and policies. Again, a lot of what we heard already was from kind of matches what other people have heard, all the concerns that these kind of projects meet, and pedestrian safety, vehicle speeds, travel times, traffic is obviously a big concern for a lot of people that do still drive. So before, for King Street, it was a 35 mile per hour speed limit, and a bit of it was 25 mile per hour. The 85th percentile speeds were above the posted speed limit, as you might expect. The peak vehicle per hour rates are listed there, generally in acceptable ranges, and our ADT was about 13,000. A little more data about that. I'll run through these because this one was on our lower end. It's right there in the 10,000 to 15,000 ADT level. So pretty good candidate for a road diet. We presented 3 options to the community, and option 3 was the one that was supported most and approved by our traffic and parking board. We provided some examples to kind of help people visualize before we were to install it, what it might look like, what a pedestrian crossing might look like here, just so people could get a sense of what the striping would look like and how they could use the road. And so here's the before pictures, a couple key areas where we planned on making improvements. And here's some afters. We implemented some curb extensions, some temporary material curb extensions, lots of striping enhancements, pedestrian refuge islands, signage, and things of the sort. So our key findings from this was that we had, at the time we pulled the data, there were 0 reported crashes in the first year. Since then, we've gone back and looked, and there was only 1 now that was recorded in that first year. So that's a pretty good improvement over an average of 7 crashes during the 10 years prior for the project. Vehicle speeds reduced a pretty significant amount, especially in an area kind of lower density area on the street. Delay at one intersection increased a little bit more than our modeling predicted. So we made some kind of remedial actions to change the signal timing and update it and accommodate more vehicles. And then traffic diversion was a concern. We saw that that did not appear to increase because of this project. Here's a quick table about the differences in the speeds and what we saw in terms of improvement and adherence to the posted speed limit. We did, through this project, reduce the speed limit on this entire corridor from 35 and 25 in certain areas, just to the whole segment is now a 25-mile-per-hour zone. A little bit more about that delay at King and Chinkapin here. About 10 seconds more delay in the AM peak hour. So we did make some adjustments to the signal timing to kind of deal with that. Here's some information about the traffic diversion on a side street, Scroggins, which connects King Street and West Braddock Road. And we are holding steady at about 13,000 ADT. So Seminary Road is a more recent project. I joined the city in 2018 in January of that year, and have been working with the city ever since. So this is the project I know most about. So our study area was essentially from Kenmore all the way to Quaker Lane along Seminary Road. But in terms of road diet and considerations for that, we really looked at Howard to North Quaker Lane. These are our project objectives. Again, pretty much match the concerns that we had heard from the community in the past that we had collected through other planning activities, just providing kind of multimodal access, safety, and transit opportunities, along with accommodating existing vehicle volumes. So this traffic volume map, we got this data from the Transurban and VDOT project that's going on with the I-395 HOT, HOV ramps at Seminary Road. So they were able to provide us some more in-depth data, kind of segment by segment, for us to really take a look at the traffic volumes and then the peak hour traffic volumes to give us more insight as to what's going on the street, whether a road diet is feasible or not. So we're right here in the 15,000 to 20,000 ADT. The crash history, we lowered the speed limit, just changing the signs in 2016 on the roadway, and saw a drop in crashes, and especially injury crashes. We saw a lot of benefit just changing the speed limit, but the vehicle speeds tended to persist to be much higher, than the posted speed limit. You can see there, excessive speeding, we had about upwards of 130 to 150 people speeding on the roadway a day. So for this one, we again offered similar alternatives and options for a striping configuration. The first one, kind of just maintaining what's there. Alternative 2 was keeping 2 lanes westbound, 1 lane eastbound. Alternative 3 was your classic road diet. And then we actually had another one come up, which is a staff recommendation of a hybrid in areas that accommodated vehicle traffic in higher volume areas, and narrowed the roads, the lane in the lower volume areas. We scored all of these according to this to show kind of what would have the most impact versus what would have the most improvement over existing conditions. I won't go too far into that, but just so you guys get an idea of what we showed the community and what this might look like for you. And then council adopted the alternative 3 road diet option and directed staff to implement that. So that's what we did. You can see the striping before and after, your typical 4 lane, and then we implemented the road diet there with substantial completion happening in about January of this year. Here's some more construction photos from Seminary Roads. You can see there's 2 types of medians that we used. One was your typical pedestrian refuge island with rapid flashing beacons. The second was a mountable median island, and we used that specifically at the request of our fire and EMS department, so that they could traverse the middle lanes where they would need to kind of get past traffic if traffic queues were backed up, where people could not, and passenger vehicles could not pull to the actual concrete curbs. The kind of parking stops and flex posts you see there are for an interim in-street kind of side path where we don't have a sidewalk that connects right now, but are working on constructing one. Here's a little more detail on those two pedestrian refuge options that we used. And then evaluation. So we have also been directed to evaluate this project after about 18 months of normalization. I'm not sure if that timeline is going to change, given that we're not kind of in normal times right now. But we are planning to evaluate this road diet project when that time comes. Now, throughout the construction, I completely agree with Nicole. Giving people a heads up about what's going on, traffic alerts using signage was really helpful. We ended up doing kind of weekly updates to our council members. This was a really high profile project. A lot of people were really interested in one way or another. And so people wanted to know what was going on, what we were seeing. We're lucky to have the infrastructure on our streets and in our signals that we can get real-time travel times and pull those specifically for this corridor. So across the day, we did see a slight increase of about the expected amount of time. We are seeing a little bit more congestion in the morning, westbound direction. That goes up to about a minute in the worst 15 minutes of the day. Another way that we have looked at is our Dash is our transit provider in the city. The main bus that runs on that route is the AT2, and their on-time performance kind of helped us see where we are with this project versus others, versus their normal kind of operating service. So for any more information, all of these projects and more are listed on our website. You can reach out to me. I can add my contact information if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Christine. And we, while you still have the screen, actually, a few questions came in, asked if you could share a little bit more detail about, there was a slide you had about 2 median types. So folks said they wanted to just see that for a minute longer, and if you could add any more detail about maybe the differences between some of these two.
Yeah, sure. So your standard median there on the right side, I think people generally have seen those and are familiar with that, but the one on the left was specifically designed for this street and this this setting. Seminary Road in this kind of segment is one of the primary access routes to the hospital and also to a fire station. So we get a lot of emergency vehicles kind of coming through here. So having consultant help with this, we sat down and designed essentially like a concrete speed hump, if you want to think of it that way, that emergency vehicles could traverse. So we designed that sitting in the room, kind of sketching out with our fire department battalion chief. And so we were able to design these kind of red poured concrete pedestrian refuges that met their needs.
Gotcha. Great. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. I think that answered some of the questions that came up. I appreciate the distinction between these two. I guess a follow-up question I'd have is on the right. Obviously, we're using some of the in-street signage, some of the rapid flashing beacon mounts, and or you keep those off totally from the left side. That's what I'm understanding?
Correct.
When you do the mountable? Yeah. Okay. I understand that. Okay, great. Well, let's move into the discussion period, more formally here, and I'm gonna bring the screen over because what I have is contact information for our panelists. We want to make sure that if you want to follow up with anyone, that you can do that. And so I've got email addresses here. You can follow up with us as well. But we're going to try to get through as many questions as possible. You all raised quite a few good ones in your when you submitted those. So let me go back to the top and maybe ask Peter and Lance and John a question that came in around using the two-way left turn on these road diets. You showed a lot of examples, a lot of pictures of where you had incorporated that two-way left turn on sort of your typical road diet or lane conversion. And then there were some examples where you showed not a two-way left turn there, but instead in the middle there was a sort of a double yellow line or otherwise painted median, sort of a more formal median, though it was just painted. And folks are wondering about what's the guidance on kind of when you use that two-way left turn versus when you are going to use more of a formal painted median. Maybe you might ultimately use maybe down the road a continuous raised median or something like that. So I wonder if any of you could share sort of the general guidelines on that.
That's a good question. I don't know that I could share specific guidance other than if there's not places to turn, you don't need a two-way left turn lane. It's sort of in the past, I think people would sometimes stripe it that way because it was easy to just continue it. But if you don't have any entrances where people might turn, it doesn't need to be there. If
Another thing, I'll jump in, Peter, and
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Mention is that doing a pocketed left turn, our standards allow you to get down to 11 feet for a pocketed left turn, and then hashing out. And then, but if you use a two-way left turn, it's 12 foot. So sometimes that 1 foot makes a difference of whether you could squeeze bike lanes in your project or not. And I know Fairfax is very familiar with that. But yeah, if there's no place to turn, you don't need one. If there's so many driveways you can't pocket your left turns, you have to use a two-way left turn. And if your entrances are spaced out enough where you can pocket them, then that's the ideal situation.
And if I may add to that, we actually changed on Lawyers Road from a two-way left turn lane to the left turn pockets in the second time we repaved the road because we had issues with illegal passing using that lane, and doing the left turn pockets really made clear that this is not a lane that can be used for passing. So it further enhanced the safety of the road and clarified, the legal traffic pattern. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, Nicole, that's great because you jumped into a question that I was going to ask next, which was about some, because it's different, it seems different maybe from where people are from. So I wanted to clarify what the rules or laws were around using that left turn lane for passing. And if that's something that you'd seen a lot of, and I identified one example there, Nicole, but I guess just generally around the state when you did some of that research, is that an issue that you confronted or uncovered, I guess, in places where you use that two-way left turn? I guess any of the VDOT presenters, was that something identified?
It's not supposed to be used as a passing lane, but it is frequently used that way, especially if there are stopped vehicles in the through lane, such as a bus or a postal vehicle. So I think that issue comes up, especially in a public meeting, if people say, well, that's a suicide lane, and people are going to zoom in it and have head-on collisions. But at least in Virginia, its intent is for left turns only.
Okay, I see. Okay, well, thank you for that. And then another follow-up example, when we think about STEP and some of those other countermeasures, the real enticing aspect of these road diets, in some ways, is you do the road diet and you have that area now that you can install a raised median. And so I wonder to what degree, and maybe you covered this, Peter, I'm sorry if I missed it, the many examples you looked at across Virginia, has there been, or could there potentially be kind of a revisiting of those sites and find out how many might have added those refuge islands in key locations where pedestrian crossings had taken place? Is it your sense that that's sort of a logical next step for maybe some of these projects?
Yeah, but some of them, because they were done as part of the resurfacing program, would need to have a separate capital project prioritized, often locally funded, to add those vertical elements, where the resurfacing would only include pavement markings and sometimes signage that might be required. So including those raised medians are things that Fairfax has done as separate improvements.
Okay. And so then I'll ask, I guess, Nicole, about that. And I wondered, I've seen some examples of maybe some lower cost, you know, I don't even want to call them tactical urbanism style projects, but maybe simple painting projects to kind of do some medians, but maybe they're not raised initially. And I know the capital budgets can be really tight, but I wonder if the county or has other mechanisms of maybe designing or building out some of these in an interim way. Could you speak to any experience you have doing that?
So we do more, I wouldn't call it tactical urbanism, but more interim striping project on a regular basis. Actually, VDOT does them as well in Fairfax County. If a safety issue arises, for example, a pedestrian bump out with flex posts instead of concrete bump out, or if there are drainage issues. So we are doing these in a different coordination on a day-to-day basis. Both VDOT and Fairfax County have a small budget for these type of improvements. It's pretty limited. Unfortunately, we don't have too much of a wiggle room when it comes to very innovative tactical urbanism style markings, such as you know, art on the street on a state road. That's not something we have done yet, even though we're interested in pursuing something like this in the future at some point as well.
Okay, thank you. And Christine,
Dan, can I jump in?
Oh, yes, please.
Just on the turn lane question, I'm looking back at our inventory, sort of our working inventory of what localities had done. It was definitely not a universal thing to add that two-way left turn lane. There were some cases where a facility maybe had one lane in each direction and a two-way left turn lane in the before condition, and was reconfigured to remove that left turn lane in order to add parking on the street or to add bicycle lanes. So it kind of depends on what the goals are of the project.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. Christine, I wanted to make sure I involved you in this discussion of median islands, and because we just looked at a couple of the examples that you're using, that mountable example and then the more traditional type, and both seem like a sort of more in the capital project, so sort of the more budget heavy kind of items. And I wondered if you all are using any sort of the more temporary interim materials to build those out, at least as an initial phase.
So I am usually, you know, non-COVID budget seasons, I have a pretty decent budget, but we do also focus our funding. We only do one of these projects every 2 years, maybe. So we have the funding to kind of build out those medians, you know, when we're out there doing the resurfacing of the street. We have used interim kind of paint and post setups for curb extensions more frequently because of the drainage and kind of curb line changing and sometimes parking implications. The paint and post tends to work better in our cases for the those curb extensions.
Okay, great. No, thanks for that. We have quite a few people who are interested in not just the urban applications, which seem very complex and maybe more common, but some of these rural application of a road diet, and speaking maybe more toward the state example of the many examples that you all identified. To what degree are you seeing these projects being implemented in what you'd consider more rural locations on rural roads? And if they're being done there, have you identified any, you know, is it maybe easier to get a road diet implemented and put in a rural place, or are there some challenges that you've experienced that actually make it fairly difficult in certain ways? I wonder if any of the Virginia DOT panelists would have a response to that.
Yeah.
You want to go, Peter, or you want me to?
You think about specific challenges. I'll just mention that when I'm thinking of rural areas, it's often not sort of out in the boondocks, it's in a small town that's in the middle of a rural area. So the town of Amherst, the town of Alta Vista. These are fairly small places that have a main street that was a 4-lane undivided, or was in Amherst, it was 1 lane in each direction with on-street parking and a center turn lane, and it was reconfigured to add bicycle lanes. So these are maybe, it depends on your definition, if it's rural or if it's a small town. But your issues there are often that the town may not control the street. There's a lot of involvement of VDOT to make the changes happen.
Okay. And any, maybe it was John on the challenges side of things?
Yeah. One challenge we've heard in the rural areas is that the paving contractors may not be at the same level as you have in the urban areas. So I know on one of our projects, it was a challenge for VDOT because the traffic engineer had to be out there in the middle of the night watching the pavement contractor as they did the job, and just making sure everything was going to plan because they just had no experience doing bike lanes before.
Okay. Well, that certainly would be a challenge, I'd imagine. That's very interesting. I wanted to ask, I don't know if it's along those same lines, maybe it's building out from rural back to just generally with road diets. There's a few of our attendees are saying in their areas and their states that maintenance funds, it sounds like, are distributed to agencies on a lane mile basis. And their experience has been, if in the discussions in road diets, they're actually hearing that if you go down in the number of lanes and those lane miles decrease, then that limits available funding for maintenance. Is that an experience in Virginia? You all, is that a problem you've worked with, or is that not necessarily the case?
Yes, I'm laughing about this because
in Virginia, cities are distributed lane miles from a state formula, or just distributed maintenance funding via a formula that takes into account lane miles. VDOT, however, is not. So up until about 2014, and there was a couple tweaks in 2015, that was a major deterrent for some cities to pursue road diets. The figure, I think, for arterials, I think was about $14,000 a lane mile at that time. So that's how much you'd be losing. But that law was changed to where you can now do a certain amount of lane reductions for transit lanes or for bike lanes. And so far, no city has gone up to the threshold where they've gone too much.
Right.
But that's not a challenge for VDOT. It's all kind of like pavement quality distribution for VDOT.
And it was something that existed for a long time and was discussed for a long time and ultimately required a change to state law. It was not something VDOT could change on its own.
I see. Okay. Well, thanks for clarifying. It sounds like that's not just the case in Virginia, maybe for other places too. So it sounds like the example is worthwhile to look at, and maybe some of the changes to other pieces that need to happen first. So I appreciate the insight on that point. We had many more questions about urban arterials and road diets on urban arterials. This is really where it seems that most of the pedestrian and bicyclist activity is, and as well as a lot of traffic and maybe some more complications. I wanted to actually, Nicole, I wanted to get you involved in this question. And there's several of these folks on the webinar who have asked about urban arterial road diets and the corresponding changes to traffic signal timing that they've learned that the first time around, it may be really challenging if you don't closely look at your signals, but if you can go back and maybe make some of those modifications, then they'll be successful. And I'm wondering if there was a learning process there for some of your road diets, if you had some experiences where you kind of developed knowledge for future applications, if you could speak to anything there related to signals.
So our road diets in Fairfax County are often not touching signals. That's one of the compromises we have to make in our rapid implementation process. And sometimes we have to go back with the capital project to make a connection. The 4-to-3 conversions do go through the signal. For example, there's a new turn lane, so the signals will need to be retimed or changed. but I'm honestly not a signal expert, so I'm not sure where VDOT makes these adjustments. But I am aware that if there is a public concern after the road diet is implementing, and we hear from folks that it takes longer to cross an intersection, that we coordinate with VDOT, and they quickly change the situation, retime the signal to allow a longer green phase, for example, if there truly is an issue.
I see. Okay. And Christine, you had identified at least one of your examples. You had mentioned some modifications to signals, or some of the challenges maybe at the signalized intersection that maybe made that one more successful. I don't know if that's a general theme in some of your road diets. I imagine in Alexandria you're having to do a lot of looking at your signals when you do roadwise, just to make everything work, and especially for turning vehicles. Is that the case?
Right. Yeah, that is definitely the case, and we had, especially for the Seminary Road project, I think a lesson learned would be to kind of keep an eye on things after you implement and after you kind of reinstall, if you have detection or whatever, and you kind of put in your new signal timings. Just keep an eye out. We all took shifts monitoring traffic, being out there on the road, seeing what was happening. And for a couple of weeks there, our traffic signal engineer was there kind of tweaking timing, seeing what would work for one time, looking at it a couple days, seeing if that improved conditions. So it was definitely an iterative process. So modeling alone is not going to be, especially when it comes to signals and higher volume roads, is not going to be kind of a silver bullet. So you have to be out there and understand that you will have to make some tweaks.
Right, definitely. I think that's important. I think there may be some folks, it sounds like there's some folks who may be wanting everything to be perfect before they really jump into it. And I think it seems like it's a learning process from what we've heard today. You do need to make those adjustments along the way. Thanks for sharing that perspective.
Some of our experience has been when you have really closely spaced signals. For example, in the city of Richmond, I think they're 400-foot length blocks. The impact you're going to have on vehicle congestion is the ADT can be much lower than those guidelines you see when they're so closely spaced, versus like a Fairfax situation. If you've got signals every mile, then you have a lot of space to go back down. And in some of those places, if you can't fit your turn lanes in at the signals, because your blocks are so short, it makes it so a road diet isn't going to work. We have a couple situations where we couldn't implement something because the signals were spaced too closely together.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks for that. I think we have time for this one last question, and Peter, it's one for you, and then I'd actually ask as many people to weigh in as possible. But since you mentioned, Peter, you've got all this great information now about road diets in the state, all this data. You mentioned maybe some ideas for future research. You mentioned crash modification factors and developing those. I wonder if there are any other things you think you could study about road diet experience in Virginia. Are there any other questions that you all have about that you maybe want to know the answer to, and could now do that with the data you've accumulated?
Oh, future research, always a recommendation of research. The crash modification one really was the main thing that we called out in our study. But I think something else John has identified that would be useful is just having more visual before and after images, like what Christine showed, the drone footage and aerial of the before and the after can be really useful in telling the story beforehand, making the case in a public process. So it's not really research.
Yeah, sure. No, that's compelling. It can sometimes speak. This can speak as loud as some of the research findings, I'm sure. Nicole, I wanted to ask you, and then Christine, the same question. Would there be any potential research that could be looked at in terms of road diets specifically that you'd want to see and that would help guide your work?
Yeah, I would be particularly interested in the 4-lane divided. They function very differently in a road diet scenario, and for us it was really a learning by doing experience. There wasn't that much material out there that we could look at or refer to. Also, if you have a whole lane available, how best to divide the lane into the most useful pieces. How wide should the bike lane be versus the buffer? If the buffer is really wide, sometimes it looks like a travel lane and could be confusing. So we were trying out different things, and it would be helpful to have more guidance on these more unusual road diets, because in suburban areas like ours, these are called the modern roads that are overbuilt, that we would like to downsize, but it's definitely more challenging to implement.
Oh, that's a great suggestion. And Christine, any final topics to add to the research list?
Yeah, I'd agree with the divided scenarios. We have a couple that are planned for transit lanes and things like that. So it would be definitely a help to have more research on that.
Great. Thank you so much. And I want to say thanks to our entire panel. We don't have any more time for questions, but I do hope that you all will help or follow up with us or follow up with our panelists if you do have remaining questions that we can help answer. I really enjoyed the webinar today. I hope you all did as well. I appreciate you all joining us. And I wanted to say a special thank you to our entire panel for their time and sharing their perspectives on this webinar. We will be sending you a follow-up email later today with details about how you can get a certificate for the webinar, where you can find the archive. We'll have the recording posted, so we'll be sending all that out to you. And I hope you'll join us again in a few weeks, July 29th, for a discussion about regional approaches and state partnerships for Complete Streets projects. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you next time. Thank you.